In the previous video, we looked at Part 3, Conversations, and discussed the strategies necessary to solve that part of the test. We also learned that as the listening selections become longer, the ability to eliminate answer choices becomes more difficult due to the use of partially correct information in many of the distractors. And we'll see this again in Part 4. So, in our final video, we're looking at the short talk section of the test. Now, once again, we'll be using sample information from the TOEIC download, but please do not look at the download right now. We'll be analyzing the transcript a little bit later in this video. Also, remember that there's no note-taking on the actual test. So, the directions of this section, you will hear some talks given by a single speaker. You will be asked to answer 3 questions about what the speaker says in each talk. Select the best response to each question and mark the letter A, B, C, or D on your answer sheet. Again, the talks will not be printed in your test book and will be spoken only one time. Now we're going to go ahead and jump right into this listening activity. So go ahead and find a piece of paper and number 71 through 73 on that piece. And we will place the questions and answer choices on the screen during the listening passage. So that way you'll get the full experience of what it's like on the test. So here are the questions. I'll give you just a couple of seconds to look at them. Now let's begin. Thank you for calling Central Electric Services, your local power company. We are still experiencing problems with power failures caused by the recent storm. We expect service to be back up in most areas early this evening, although some homes in the Northwest will be without electricity until tomorrow morning, and it may be tomorrow evening before service is fully restored in all areas. We apologize for the inconvenience this has caused our customers, and we thank you for your continued patience as we work to resolve these problems. This service announcement will be updated throughout the day. It was last updated at 6:00 a.m. on Sunday, April 3rd. Number 71. Where would this announcement be heard? Number 72. What is the purpose of the announcement? Number 73. When is the problem expected to be completely resolved? Okay, let's go ahead now and check the answers. So, number 71, where would this announcement be heard? Well, again, the idea here is that this was a recorded announcement, so most likely we would hear this on the telephone in calling the company. Number 72, the purpose of the announcement was to provide information about electric services, which is choice B. And number 73, when is the problem expected to be completely resolved? Again, the key word here is completely. And the answer is D, tomorrow evening. So first off, let's talk about what we notice. The talk itself is a monologue, which means basically one person speaking. And it's something that we could possibly encounter every day. So for example, a weather bulletin, a traffic alert perhaps, again, a phone message from a company. It also could be involving a business event we're attending. So, for example, if it's a meeting where one person is speaking, perhaps a conference or a lecture given at a business conference, or a sales talk, perhaps given by a manager to his or her sales team. Now, the questions themselves, if you notice, the questions didn't necessarily give us a lot of information. they really were there just to help focus our thinking. So they kind of focus more on just the important details of the passage. So, for example, what type of announcement? But notice we were not asked about the company's name. So minor details, this would be an example of a minor detail. And we notice that they also follow the organization and sequence of the talk. Now, this brings us to our first TOEIC hint. And the idea here is that time, of course, is very precious on this part of the test. So we will notice that it's the beginning of the listening passage that will really help give us some information to help focus our thinking during the rest of the passage. So often what I tell students is to pay attention specifically to the beginning. Now, this kind of connects back to something we discussed in the reading series for the TOEIC, which is kind of the idea that the format of the talk will also help us understand where information will be located. So in this case, we should be able to guess that from the first couple of lines at the beginning of the passage. Now, the questions themselves may also help, but I think you will find that they will not always help. So it really would be helpful to kind of think about those first two lines. So what we're going to do now, just for a moment, is listen again just to the first two lines and see again if we can discuss what's the format of the talk. Thank you for calling Central Electric Services, your local power company. We are still experiencing problems with power failures caused by the recent storm. So as we noticed and noted in the answers to the questions, it is a recorded message from a power company. Now the question is for us to kind of help us in the video is to think about what are the characteristics of a recorded message and what specific type of recorded message is this? Well, first off, we have to really think that it actually was an apology of sorts, as well as explaining information about a particular event. So if we think about how do we actually organize an apology message? Well, let's look again and think about the organization of the format. So actually I'm going to go ahead and put the transcript up on the screen, but listen again as we read it, and as we follow along, we're going to be highlighting specific things that are being indicated in the format. Thank you for calling Central Electric Services, your local power company. We are still experiencing problems with power failures by the recent storm. We also expect service to be back up in most areas early this evening, although some homes in the Northwest will be without electricity until tomorrow morning. And it may be tomorrow evening before service is fully restored in all areas. We apologize for the inconvenience this has caused our customers, and we thank you for your continued patience as we work to resolve these problems. This service announcement will be updated throughout the day. It was last updated at 6 o'clock a.m. on Sunday, April 3rd. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the questions follow the order of the conversation. But since we can't take notes, the idea here is that it would be unfair for the test to have us focus on too much unnecessary or unimportant information. So really we need to start thinking about where the problem and the solutions are being discussed. Well, let's kind of think about in terms of format. Where do we put important information? Well, we have to think about those important places and ideas where information will be given. So, for example, we need to think about that there will be a sort of formal beginning, a middle, and some sort of end or conclusion to the talk. Also, signal words will be very helpful in having us identify where important information will be. And along with that, we're kind of separating out adverbs, especially adverbs of time or any intensifiers that we might see. So as we go back through the transcript again, notice that the idea here is the beginning, middle, and end are certain places where questions were being asked. And part of that is because of our attention span. Obviously, a question given at the beginning will address something at the beginning of the passage. We might have a question that will address information given in the middle. And this one is probably going to be one of the most difficult ones, because oftentimes this is where students lose attention during the passage. And then, of course, the end, well, it would make sense that maybe the last question will ask about something after that. Now, let's look a little more carefully, though. Notice, for example, we have a lot of these transition words, words that might change direction or indicate how things connect, although some homes in the Northwest. So again, notice this is kind of a trick. tomorrow evening before service is fully restored. So notice it says tomorrow evening is when that service will probably be fully restored. Now notice some of the adverbs. Still experiencing problems. We expect them to be back up in most areas early this evening until tomorrow morning and maybe tomorrow evening. Now, of course, the sequence of ideas is what we have to follow. It's tomorrow evening, which seems logical that all service would be restored. And this would make sense because it's a later time than the 2 times mentioned before. So this kind of brings us back to the idea of active listening. If you recall in the previous video, we discussed that active listening involves processing the content of the passage quickly. So really for this section of the test, it means that we need to identify 3 to 4 key ideas while thinking about synonyms or synonymous language. And that's especially important when we look at the answer choices. So if we think about the 3 or 4 key ideas that were being discussed in the passage, well, first off, the basic idea was we have an electric company that's still having power failures because of a storm. Service will be back up this evening, but some homes not until tomorrow. Full service, and that's the key, full service is tomorrow evening. So as we're listening, we pick up on those particular words. And they're sorry and they're trying to fix the problem. Now notice as we're trying to remember these ideas, we're rephrasing them as we listen. In other words, we're trying to get a lot more active using the vocabulary that's given in the passage, but then having us kind of paraphrase information in our own words. So again, notice, for example, apologize. Well, instead of saying apologize, let's think about, well, we're sorry for this. It's an inconvenience, and we work to resolve the problem. So notice resolving the problem basically means to fix it. Now, why is this helpful? Well, because as we saw in the previous video, the answer choices don't always involve words that are the same. So that's why we're trying to use synonyms or synonymous ideas to keep us more active as we're listening, because the answers themselves may not always have the same words or language. So this gets us to think about the tricks. Again, we said in the previous video, don't look at the answer stem. The answer stem itself is probably going to include a lot of these common tricks that we've seen. Now, as we mentioned in part 3, you are allowed to see the questions and the answer choices. And the questions should help you focus on the most important information, and in fact could give you a quick way to identify the format and problem of the talk, though not always. But remember, there are the usual TOEIC ways that they're going to try to confuse or trick you. Look again at the questions and answer stems. So notice one of the most common tricks, again, is to use partially correct information. So notice here in the underlined words, these were all words and ideas they directly stated in the passage. So again, notice in 71, they did mention company as a power company. They did mention that there was a storm. But again, a power company wouldn't tell you about a storm that's approaching. The storm already happened. Notice apologize. That was almost the exact same word they used. It was the exact same word they used in the passage. Shortages. Of course, shortages were not referring to staffing. They were referring to electrical shortages or shortages in power. And then, of course, again, the word company was mentioned. So part of the idea is we have to kind of guess the information using our own sort of thought process. So, for example, in 71, we have to sort of infer the idea that it's from the telephone. And that's because we do hear the idea that it's a service announcement. It sounds very much like a recorded message. And B, notice it says just to provide information about electric services. And remember, that's because this is the more expansive idea. We said in the previous video that the answer choice is going to be more expansive, not just using the same words, but using words that are kind of similar in meaning. So again, sometimes the answers themselves are going to be the expansive answer choices, words that don't necessarily involve specific words, but kind of explain the basic idea. In 73, notice in this one, and this is a fairly common trick on this part of the test, we're almost given too many options in the talk. And then for 73, this is a pretty common trick on this part of the test, is to think about the fact that they gave us too many options in the talk. They gave us all of these, or at least most of them. The question was, could we process the information quickly? Now, even just by looking at the answer choices, we could probably guess. First off, in 73, they say that it needs to be completely resolved. Well, again, they did not use the words completely resolved. They just said that they hope to have full service, or to have complete service. So in this case, we had to kind of think about, well, what would make the most sense? Well, it seems that as we followed the listening, the last idea that was mentioned was tomorrow evening. And that does seem to be a pretty good choice. But we had to actively process that information. So, for example, perhaps what if they didn't even mention tomorrow evening? We would still have to be able to guess from the information given here. So, again, part of the problem is we have to be able to process information quickly as we listen. So, as you can see, looking at the answer stem first can confuse and even distract you. But the questions almost always address the most important points of the talk. And finally, if you see many dates, days, times, or numbers, these are probably there to trick you. So it's likely that at least one of the questions will involve this situation. So, as we mentioned in the first video, and have been discussing throughout the series, there are 4 parts to the listening comprehension section. The photograph section, the question and response, conversations, and the short talks. And all of this will take basically around 45 minutes to complete. In the photograph section, we mentioned that you have to be able to see information in a photograph and recognize information that you can prove, not necessarily what we think might be important in the picture. Memory or test-taking strategies are going to be necessary because information is not repeated. And remember, the most common tricks involve similar sounding words or parts of words, and partially correct information that can be seen in the photo itself. And recall that you cannot see the questions or answer choices. In the question and response, we basically discussed a lot of the same tricks, similar sounding words, or words or ideas that make sense in other contexts. We also mentioned that since these are questions, we have to be able to recognize the specific characteristics of each type of question. And that refers to yes or no questions, question words, and tag questions. And remember, you cannot see anything on this part of the test, so those memory test-taking strategies will definitely be needed here. In Part 3, in the conversations, we recall that they are not actually real conversations. They're mainly opportunities for one speaker to help explain a problem or situation, and the other speaker to help kind of move the conversation along. The questions that we are given often involve the main ideas or details about the conversation, and the correct answers often involve choices that use synonymous language, not the exact words from the listening. And remember, you can see both the questions and the answer choices during the listening, but it's probably better to focus only on the questions before you listen. And think about that many of the same tricks from the first 2 parts apply here as well. In our video today, we talked about the idea that this part of the test really involves your ability to process information quickly in the order you hear it. The format of the talk will also help you in identifying where important information will be located, and signal words and adverbs will also help. Remember, the questions will be about the main points of the conversation, not minor or unimportant details. And the correct answers will often involve choices that use synonymous language, not exact words from the listening. Now, we discussed memory and test-taking strategies. Well, again, 2 problems that the test presents at this point is that we cannot take notes, and the listening passage and questions and answers are given only once. So our traditional sort of process of elimination strategies will not necessarily apply here. Instead, we have to use a combination of memory and alternative test-taking strategies to improve performance. Now recall that we said one strategy was to repeat the questions and answer choices to yourself quietly, in the order that you hear them as they're being given. And this is especially true for parts 1 and 2, since we can't see the questions or answers. Now, while doing this, one idea we discussed was positioning your pencil over the answer choices to help focus your attention, and to move the pencil each time the answer choice is given. This way, you'll be able to fill in the answer quickly, because you don't have a lot of time in between questions. Now, another strategy, one that we haven't discussed, and this is especially helpful, I think, for parts 2 through 4, is to actually close your eyes during the listening passage and visualize the people in the situation. Now, at this point in the series, it's probably a good idea to discuss how we can continue to improve for this part of the test. Well, part of the idea is students often think that listening is just turning on a TV or radio in the background. That's not true. We really need to engage in more purposeful listening, because listening does require discipline and active attention. So, take time out of the day to listen to, not just to watch, the news on the radio or on the internet. There are lots of resources that contain both the listening event and the transcript. And then try listening to the event even before you look at the transcript. You also might want to think about testing your ability to remember and summarize what is being said in this listening activity. So, for example, after you listen, just take a few minutes and talk to yourself. However, I do think that it might be helpful to take notes. Now, obviously we can't do this for the test, but I do think that this skill will help you in learning about which information is important and which is not. Another idea is to keep a separate journal of new vocabulary words that you learn every day. We need to be more purposeful in the words that we're learning. And make sure you're practicing with different accents. Obviously, I couldn't do different accents on this video series, but the truth is, on the TOEIC, you will hear speakers from different countries: British English, American English, Australian English, even Canadian English. So don't just focus on American English. And try to engage in more conversation with other people. And finally, this is the most important thing. This is something you have to practice. Again, listening is a purposeful activity, so try to do this a little bit every day. So practice, practice, practice. Now, some resources, and I will list these below the video as well on the YouTube channel. National Public Radio is a good resource. They are available. You can listen to them, obviously, from your local radio station or from www.npr.org, or you can download the NPR app from iTunes or the Android Market. You can also obtain transcripts of almost all the stories you hear on NPR. Voice of America is another good resource, especially their Learn English link. And they also do have a new mobile app that you can use on your smartphone. There are also a lot of great international websites, the BBC, for example, Canadian Broadcasting, even Australian Broadcasting, just to help you get used to the different accents you may hear on the test. And finally, iTunes has a lot of podcasts that might be helpful that you might want to listen to. So our final thoughts. Improving listening can occur a little bit faster than reading. Obviously, we have to listen almost every day. So it becomes even easier when you get more comfortable with the accents of the speakers. Now, the one thing I need to stress, and I stress this in the reading series as well, is that learning more English is ultimately the only way to improve on the test. Improving your vocabulary, improving your listening skills. There's only so much test preparation that you can do. And remember, listening is not a passive activity. It does require attention and active thought. Finally, to remind you that there are lots of great materials out there for preparing for the test: the official TOEIC website, the great series by Grant True from Oxford University Press, and our new TOEFL TOEIC preparation website. Thanks for watching this video series. We'll see you in 2013 for the TOEIC Speaking Skills series.